Dust choked Oakhaven's main street long before his shadow fell across saloon doors. Blood stained his buckskin coat. Speaking of a brutal winter high in bitter peaks, silence swallowed every conversation when Jedediah Rawlins stepped inside. Eyes darted away from his scarred jaw and cold, slate-gray gaze. He slammed a heavy leather pouch onto cracked wood, gold coins spilling out. "I need a wife by tomorrow," he announced, voice grating like two stones rubbing together. Whispers erupted, but one woman stepped forward from the shadows. Clara leaned close, lips brushing rough wool, asking one single, chilling question. Spring had not yet touched the Montana Territory in 1884, leaving the town of Oakhaven mired in a miserable purgatory of frozen mud and biting winds. Nestled at the foot of the jagged Bitterroot Mountains, Oakhaven was a place where desperate men came to hide, and greedy men came to rule. Jedediah Rawlins belonged to neither category. He was a creature of the high altitudes, a mountain man who traded in pelts, timber, and the kind of isolation that drove lesser men mad. Yet, on this dismal Tuesday afternoon, the mountain man had descended into the valley, driven not by the changing seasons, but by the cold, calculated threat of paper and ink. Jedediah stood just inside the swinging doors of the rusty spur, letting his eyes adjust to the dim, smoke-filled interior. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a thick coat of wolf and bear hide. A long, jagged scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jawline, a souvenir from a grizzly that had contested his claim to a winter cave 3 years prior. His hair was dark and shaggy, grazing his collar, and his beard was thick, hiding the hard set of his mouth. A heavy Winchester rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm, while a staghorn-handled Bowie knife sat sheathed at his belt. The saloon, previously a riot of drunken laughter, clinking glasses, and a discordant piano, went dead silent. Arthur Pennyworth, a balding bartender with a perpetually nervous sweat, froze with a rag halfway inside a whiskey glass. Card games halted mid-deal. Even the ladies of the evening, usually eager to welcome a man with a full coin purse, shrank back against the flocked red wallpaper. They all knew Jedediah Rawlins. They knew the stories of how he had survived an avalanche by digging his way out with his bare hands, and how he had tracked a band of rustlers across 50 miles of frozen tundra to retrieve a single stolen pack mule. Jedediah ignored the terrified stares. His boots, heavy and caked with mountain snow, thudded against the floorboards as he made his way to the bar. He did not ask for a drink. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy, oilskin pouch. He slammed it down on the mahogany surface with a force that rattled the bottles on the shelves behind Arthur. The pouch fell open, revealing a glittering cascade of newly minted double eagles and raw, uncut gold nuggets. "I need a wife by tomorrow," Jedediah announced. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any warmth or pleasantry. It was a statement of fact, a demand laid bare before the denizens of Oakhaven. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Men exchanged bewildered glances. Why would a man who actively shunned human contact suddenly demand a bride with such violent urgency? The answer lay folded in the breast pocket of Jedediah's shirt, a legal summons signed by Judge Horace Langdon. Langdon was a man whose pockets were deeply lined by the Pacific Northwestern Railroad conglomerate. The railroad wanted a path straight through Whispering Pines, the lush, high-altitude valley that Jedediah had claimed and legally registered 10 years ago. Unable to buy him out and unwilling to face him in a gunfight, Langdon had found a loophole in the territorial land grant charters. The charter stipulated that for a tract of land exceeding 200 acres to remain under single ownership without agricultural development, the owner must be the head of an established household. Langdon had issued a decree. Jedediah had 30 days to present a legal wife to the county clerk, or his claim would be dissolved and seized by the territory and subsequently sold to the railroad. Tomorrow at noon was the deadline. "Well?" Jedediah barked, his slate-gray eyes scanning the room. I am offering $1,000 in gold to the woman who will stand before a preacher with me tonight. You will live in my cabin. You will be fed, sheltered, and protected. You will not be expected to act as a frontier servant, but you will wear my name." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. $1,000 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a prosperous farm back east, or passage on a ship to anywhere in the world. Yet, the prospect of living in total isolation with a man who looked like he had wrestled demons and won kept the women rooted to their spots. They looked at his sheer size, the wildness in his eyes, and the blood that still stained the hem of his coat from a freshly dressed elk, and their courage failed them. From the corner of the room, a man chuckled. It was Deputy Marshal Clinton, a sneering, brutal man who acted as Judge Langdon's personal enforcer. "Look around, Rawlins," Clinton drawled, resting his hand on the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "No civilized woman is going to drag herself up a mountain to live in a cave with a savage. Looks like the railroad is going to get that valley after all. You better start packing." Jedediah turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the deputy. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "I ain't speaking to you, Clinton. Keep your teeth together before I decide to remove them." Clinton bristled, his face flushing crimson, but he didn't draw his weapon. Nobody drew a weapon on Jedediah Rawlins unless they were entirely prepared to die. "I said," Jedediah repeated, his voice echoing off the tin ceiling, "I need a wife." The heavy oak doors of the saloon groaned as a figure pushed through them, letting in a gust of frigid wind. It wasn't one of the saloon girls, nor was it a desperate farm daughter. It was Clara Higgins. Clara was 26, though the harsh realities of frontier life had aged her eyes beyond her years. She was dressed in a faded, threadbare wool dress that had once been navy blue but was now the color of bruised skies. Her hands were raw and red from lye soap, a testament to her days spent scrubbing the floors of the Oakhaven Mercantile and taking in laundry for the town's elite. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun, but a few rebellious strands escaped to frame a face that possessed a sharp, unyielding sort of beauty. The town knew Clara's tragedy well. 2 years ago, her husband, a gentle schoolteacher named Peter Higgins, had been found shot dead in an alley behind the bank. The local authorities, specifically Sheriff Wyatt Eakin, had ruled it a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence by a passing drifter. But Clara knew better. She knew Peter had discovered discrepancies in the town's ledger, money being funneled from the municipal taxes directly to Judge Langdon and Sheriff Eakin. Since Peter's murder, Clara had been systematically starved out. The bank foreclosed on her small home. Businesses were pressured not to hire her for anything but menial labor, and she was drowning in fabricated debts designed to force her into indentured servitude or drive her out of town entirely. Clara walked past the gawking patrons, her posture perfectly straight, ignoring the condescending murmurs of the men and the pitying looks of the women. She stopped 2 feet away from Jedediah. He towered over her, casting a long, intimidating shadow. But Clara did not flinch. She looked directly into his storm-gray eyes, searching for something a spark of honor, perhaps, or merely the capacity for violence. $1,000, Clara said, her voice quiet but possessing a steel edge that cut through the lingering silence of the room. "And I wear your name. Those are the terms?" Jedediah stared down at the small woman. He noted the fraying cuffs of her dress, the exhaustion bruising the skin beneath her eyes, but mostly, he noted the absolute absence of fear. "Those are the terms," he confirmed. "We marry tonight. We leave for the mountain before dawn. You will not return to this town." Clara took a deliberate step closer. The scent of pine needles, wood smoke, and cold, fresh snow clung to him. She stood on her tiptoes, leaning in so close that her cheek almost brushed the rough wool of his collar and the thick fur of his bear hide coat. The saloon held its collective breath, watching this delicate, ruined woman press herself near the mountain man. She whispered, her voice so low that only Jedediah could hear it. "If I give you my life,
This
my
story
name,
was
and
posted
my
on the
future,
channel The Rusty
will
Saddle.
you kill a man
Please
for
do
me?"
not repost it in any
Jedediah
form.
didn't blink. His expression remained carved from granite. He didn't ask who, and he didn't ask why. He recognized the look in her eyes. He had seen it in the eyes of cornered wolves and wounded panthers. It was the absolute, distilled essence of a soul that had nothing left to lose and only vengeance left to gain. "Yes," Jedediah whispered back, the word rumbling deep in his chest. Clara stepped back, her face an unreadable mask. "Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Rollins." The saloon erupted. Men shouted. Arthur dropped his glass, and Deputy Clinton pushed his way forward. "Now see here, Clara," Clinton barked. "You owe the bank $300. You can't just run off into the hills with this wild man." Jedediah moved with a sudden, terrifying speed. He swept his hand across the bar, scooping up a handful of gold eagles, and threw them violently at Clinton's chest. The heavy coins struck the deputy hard, clattering to the floorboards. "There is your 300, and extra for your silence. Her debts are paid. If the bank has an issue, tell them to come up the mountain and collect it from me." He didn't wait for Clinton's reply. Jedediah reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently but firmly grasping Clara's elbow. "Where is the preacher?" he asked her. "Reverend Finch lives behind the Methodist Church on Elm Street," Clara replied, her voice steady. "Show me." 10 minutes later, Jedediah was pounding his heavy fist against the white-painted door of the parsonage. Reverend Josiah Finch, a frail man with thin white hair and spectacles perching precariously on his nose, opened the door holding a kerosene lamp and wearing a nightshirt. He paled significantly when he saw the towering silhouette of the mountain man standing on his porch. "Mr. Rollins," Finch stammered, pulling his robe tighter around himself. "It is nearly 10 o'clock at night. What brings you?" His eyes shifted to the woman beside him. "Clara? Mrs. Higgins, what is the meaning of this?" "I require your services, Reverend," Jedediah said, stepping into the small hallway and forcing Finch to back up. "We are to be married, tonight." Finch's wife, a stern-faced woman named Martha, appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching a shawl. "Josiah? Who is it?" she gasped when she saw the company. "Clara Higgins, have you lost your senses? You cannot marry this heathen." Clara looked up at the older woman, her eyes cold. "My senses are perfectly intact, Mrs. Finch. I am making a practical arrangement." "This is highly irregular," Reverend Finch protested, setting the lamp down on a side table with trembling hands. "Marriage is a sacred bond before God, not a midnight transaction. I require banns to be read. I require time." Jedediah reached into his pocket and pulled out another gold nugget the size of a walnut's and placed it next to the lamp. "I ain't a man of patience, Reverend. I have a legal document that says I need a wife by tomorrow noon. I will have a marriage certificate signed by you tonight, or I will find a magistrate in the next county who likes gold better than you do." Finch looked at the gold, then at his wife, and finally at Clara. "Are you doing this of your own free will, child? He hasn't coerced you?" "It is my choice, Reverend," Clara said firmly. Defeated, and perhaps a little frightened of what the mountain man might do if refused, Reverend Finch ushered them into his small parlor. He hastily donned his clerical collar over his nightshirt. There was no music, no flowers, and no joy in the room. The only witnesses were a disapproving Martha Finch and the flickering shadows cast by the oil lamp. Finch rushed through the ceremony, his voice shaking as he read the traditional vows. When it came time to exchange rings, there was an awkward pause. Jedediah reached into his vest pocket and produced a simple, smooth band carved from pale bone. "It belonged to my mother," Jedediah said quietly, offering it to Clara. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second before extending her left hand. The bone ring slid onto her finger, a cold, heavy weight replacing the gold band she had pawned a year ago to buy flour. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Finch concluded hurriedly. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. Jedediah didn't kiss his new bride. He immediately turned to the small desk in the corner. The certificate, Reverend. Sign it. With a scratchy pen and a trembling hand, Josiah Finch signed the document, making Clara Higgins into Clara Rollins. Jedediah snatched the paper before the ink was fully dry, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his breast pocket right next to Judge Langdon's ultimatum. Go pack whatever you own, Jedediah told Clara, as they stepped back out into the freezing night. We leave from the livery stable at 4 a.m. Oak Haven was completely dark when they departed. The only sound was the crunch of hooves on frozen mud. Jedediah rode a massive black draft cross named Thunder, while Clara sat awkwardly on a steady gray mare. Trailing behind them were 2 pack mules, loaded with the supplies Jedediah had purchased, with his remaining gold flour, salt, ammunition, and heavy woolen blankets. Clara had brought very little. A small canvas valise tied to the back of her saddle contained 2 extra dresses, a comb, a few undergarments, and a small, leather-bound journal that had belonged to Peter. She left nothing else behind in the town that had systematically tried to destroy her. The first few hours were traveled in absolute silence. The trail led north, away from the valley floor, and toward the towering, jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains. As the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and bleeding orange, the terrain shifted. The muddy roads gave way to steep, rocky inclines, lined with ancient, towering ponderosa pines. The temperature dropped drastically. Clara, despite wearing her thickest shawl and her only coat, began to shiver violently. Her thin leather boots, designed for wooden boardwalks, offered no protection against the creeping chill. She gripped the saddle horn tightly, determined not to complain. She had made a bargain, and she would not show weakness to the man who was now her husband and her weapon. Jedediah, riding ahead, stopped Thunder and turned around. He watched Clara for a long moment, his slate eyes assessing her rigid posture and pale lips. Without a word, he dismounted. He walked to one of the pack mules, untied a massive, heavy blanket woven from thick buffalo hair, and walked over to Clara. "Lift your arms," he commanded. Clara obeyed, too cold to argue. Jedediah draped the heavy fur over her shoulders, wrapping it around her waist and tucking the ends under her legs to insulate her from the freezing leather of the saddle. His hands were large and rough, yet surprisingly careful. "The air thins out from here," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble over the wind whistling through the pines. "It will play tricks on your lungs. Breathe through your nose. If you feel dizzy, tell me. Falling off a horse on this ridge means a 300-foot drop into the canyon. I will be fine," Clara said, her teeth chattering slightly. "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Rollins." "Jedediah," he corrected her, remounting his horse. "If we are to be married, you will call me by my name." "Jedediah," she repeated. The name felt strange on her tongue, heavy and archaic. They climbed higher. The trees grew sparser, replaced by sheer walls of granite and patches of stubborn, dirty snow that had survived the meager spring thaw. The trail narrowed until it was barely wide enough for the horses to walk single file. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the broad expanse of Jedediah's back, refusing to look down into the dizzying abyss to her right. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a half-frozen mountain stream. Jedediah broke the ice with the heel of his boot and allowed the animals to drink before offering Clara a canteen and some dried venison jerky. It tasted like smoke and salt, and she forced it down, knowing she needed the strength. "You haven't asked," Jedediah said suddenly, leaning against a boulder and watching her chew. "Asked what? Who it is you want me to kill," he replied, his tone as casual as if he were asking about the weather. Clara stopped chewing. She looked at the harsh landscape surrounding them, feeling completely disconnected from the world she had known just 24 hours ago. "Sheriff Wyatt Eakin," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if the mountain wind might carry her treason back to town. "And Mayor Harrison Caldwell.
This
They
story
ordered
was
my
posted on the
husband's
channel
murder."
The Rusty Saddle.
Jedediah's
Please do
eyes
not
narrowed
repost it
slightly,
in any form.
a subtle shift in his otherwise stoic expression. He didn't gasp. He didn't look shocked. Instead, a low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound that unsettled Clara more than anger would have. "Eakin and Caldwell," Jedediah repeated, spitting into the snow. "You aim high for a scrubwoman, Clara." "They killed Peter because he found proof they were stealing county funds," Clara said, her voice rising with sudden, fierce passion. "He was going to take the ledgers to the territorial governor. They shot him in the back and left him in an alley like a stray dog. And then they smiled at my face at his funeral. I want them dead, Jedediah. You gave me your word." "I did," Jedediah agreed smoothly. He stood up, towering over her. "And it seems fate has a twisted sense of humor, because the man who ordered Judge Langdon to seize my land, the man who stands to gain a fortune from the railroad running through my valley, is Mayor Harrison Caldwell." Clara stared at him, stunned by the revelation. "They are trying to steal your land?" "They are trying to steal my home," Jedediah corrected, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, predatory light. "They think, because I live in the clouds, I am a stupid beast they can push around with fancy paper. They forced me to find a wife. They forced you into my path. It seems Caldwell and Eakin have dug their own graves." He turned back to the horses. "We have another 3 hours. Mount up." The final leg of the journey was punishing. A spring snowstorm rolled over the peaks, pelting them with sharp, icy flakes that stung their faces. Clara felt her strength fading, her fingers numb inside her thin gloves, despite the buffalo robe. Just as she thought she might simply slip from the saddle and let the snow claim her, Jedediah led them around a massive outcropping of rock, and the wind suddenly died. They had entered Whispering Pines. Clara gasped. It was a hidden, bowl-shaped valley, sheltered by towering peaks on all sides. A pristine lake sat at the center, its surface a mirror of dark glass reflecting the stormy sky. But it wasn't the natural beauty that shocked Clara. It was the structure sitting near the tree line. She had expected a crude log shack, a trapper's hovel with a dirt floor and a leaky roof. Instead, she was looking at a formidable compound. The main cabin was massive, built from thick, perfectly joined hand-hewn cedar logs. It featured a wide, covered porch, heavy wooden shutters over glass windows, and a stone chimney smoking cheerfully. Adjacent to the cabin was a sturdy barn, a well-constructed corral, and a smokehouse. This was not the dwelling of a feral savage. It was the fortress of a man who knew how to build, survive, and defend. Jedediah dismounted and walked over to Clara's horse, reaching up to lift her down. Her legs gave way the moment her boots hit the ground, but he caught her easily, his strong arms supporting her weight. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rollins," he murmured. He practically carried her onto the porch and kicked open the heavy oak door. Inside, the cabin was a revelation. It was warm, impeccably clean, and surprisingly comfortable. A massive bear rug dominated the floor before a roaring hearth. Bookshelves lined one wall, packed tight with leather-bound volumes. A heavy oak dining table sat in the center of the room, and the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke filled the air. He set her down gently in a rocking chair near the fire. "Stay here. Thaw out. I will tend to the animals." Clara watched him leave, her mind reeling. Who was this man? He read books, built fortresses, and possessed manners that, while rough, were undeniable. When Jedediah returned half an hour later, snow dusting his shoulders, he bolted the heavy door behind him, sliding a thick iron bar into place. He walked to the corner of the room, knelt beside a heavy, iron-bound trunk, and pulled a key from a chain around his neck. "You told me your secret on the trail, Clara," Jedediah said, his back to her as the lock clicked open. "You told me who you want to kill. Now, it is time you know exactly who you married to do the job." He opened the lid of the trunk and lifted out an object wrapped carefully in oiled canvas. He turned and walked over to the firelight, unwrapping the canvas layer by layer. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in absolute shock. Resting in Jedediah's hands was a meticulously maintained, gleaming silver badge. But it was not a local deputy star. It was the heavy, imposing shield of a United States federal marshal. "My name is Jedediah Rawlins," he said softly, staring at the badge. "And until 5 years ago, I was the most lethal lawman in the Dakota Territories. I came up this mountain to forget how to kill. Mayor Caldwell just forced me to remember." The revelation hung in the quiet air of the cabin, heavier than the thick cedar logs that formed the walls. Clara stared at the silver star resting in Jedediah's massive, scarred hand. It was a U.S. Deputy Marshal badge, its edges worn smooth by years of hard riding and harder justice. "You were a lawman," Clara breathed, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping into place. His tactical awareness, the heavy armaments, the way he carried himself not as a wild beast, but as a predator operating under a strict internal code. "I was," Jedediah replied, wrapping the canvas back over the badge and locking it within the iron-bound trunk. He stood, his broad back to the hearth, casting a long shadow across the room. "I served under Judge Isaac Parker down in Fort Smith before being transferred to the Dakota Territories. I spent 10 years hunting men who thought the frontier was a blanket for their sins. Rustlers, murderers, men who burned out homesteaders for a few acres of grass." He walked over to the kitchen basin, pumping freezing water over his hands. "5 years ago, I tracked a gang of stagecoach robbers into a box canyon. It was a setup. The local sheriff had been taking a cut of their takes. When I cornered them, the sheriff's posse came up behind me. They didn't come to help. They came to bury me. I took 3 bullets that day, Clara. I killed 7 men to get out of that canyon." Clara watched him dry his hands, noticing for the first time the slight stiffness in his left shoulder, a lingering ghost of that betrayal. When the smoke cleared, Jedediah continued, his voice devoid of self-pity. "I realized the law was just another weapon wealthy men used to keep poor men in the dirt. I resigned my commission. I rode west, climbed as high as I could until the air was too thin for corrupt politicians to breathe, and I staked this claim. I swore I would never pull a trigger for another man's quarrel." He turned his slate-gray eyes upon her, the intensity pinning her to the rocking chair. "But you aren't asking me to fight for the law, Clara. You are asking me to fight for justice. There is a profound difference." Clara swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "Mayor Caldwell and Sheriff Eakin, they have the whole town terrified. They have men on their payroll, deputies, hired guns. If you go down there, it won't be an arrest. It will be a war." "I know," Jedediah said softly, "and we are not going to wait for them to bring it to us." The next morning, the reality of her new life began to take shape. Whispering Pines was completely isolated, blanketed in pristine white snow, yet the air buzzed with a quiet, lethal energy. Jedediah did not treat her as a delicate porcelain doll to be hidden away. He treated her as a partner in a very dangerous enterprise. After a breakfast of sourdough biscuits and thick cuts of bacon, Jedediah led Clara out to the barn. He didn't hand her a broom. He handed her a Colt single-action Army revolver. It was heavy, the blued steel cold against her palms. "Mayor Caldwell is backed by the Pacific Northwestern Railroad," Jedediah explained, loading the cylinder with practiced, fluid motions before handing it back to her. "But more importantly, Caldwell has the ear of Territorial Governor John Schuyler Crosby. Crosby is a politician who looks the other way if the railroad lines the territory's coffers. Caldwell will use that political cover to try and erase us. He will not wait 30 days for his ultimatum to expire. He will send men up this mountain to ensure neither of us makes it back to the claims office." He guided her behind a barricade of stacked cordwood. 50 yards away, he had set up several empty tin cans on a snow-covered ridge. Stance wide. Support your right hand with your left, Jedediah instructed.
This story was posted
standing
on the
close
channel The
behind
Rusty
her.
Saddle.
His
Please
voice
do
was
not
a deep
repost it
rumble
in any
right
form.
beside her ear, calm and steadying. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently adjusting her grip. A startling jolt of warmth shot up Clara's arms at his touch, a stark contrast to the freezing wind. Do not anticipate the recoil. Let it surprise you. Focus only on the front sight. Clara took a breath, letting the freezing mountain air fill her lungs. She thought of Peter's gentle smile. She thought of the cold, dismissive sneer on Sheriff Eakin's face at the funeral. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Colt was deafening in the quiet valley. The gun bucked violently in her hands, the smell of sulfur and burnt powder stinging her nose. 50 yards away, a tin can leaped into the air, spinning wildly before vanishing into the snow. Jedediah didn't offer lavish praise. He simply nodded, a glint of genuine respect in his eyes. Again, they spent 3 days preparing. Clara learned to clean and oil the Winchester rifles, stack ammunition, and dress the wounds Jedediah warned might be inevitable. In the evenings, sitting by the fire, the harshness of their mission softened into something else. They talked, not of murder or revenge, but of the lives they had lost. Clara spoke of her childhood in Ohio, of the fever that took her parents, and the quiet, desperate hope she and Peter had carried to Montana. Jedediah listened, truly listened, his imposing frame relaxed in the firelight. In return, he taught her how to read the mountain, how to predict a blizzard by the smell of the wind, and how to identify the tracks of a mountain lion versus a lynx. It was a strange, rugged intimacy. There were no declarations of love, no sweeping romances. But when Clara fell asleep in the heavy timber bed, wrapped in buffalo robes, she felt a profound sense of safety she hadn't known in 2 years. Jedediah slept on a bedroll near the door, a silent, immovable guardian between her and the world that had tried to break her. On the 4th morning, the mountain spoke. The warning came not from a shout, but from the sudden, sharp cry of a Steller's jay echoing down the canyon, followed by the agitated whinny of thunder in the corral. Jedediah was instantly awake, his hand wrapping around the stock of his Winchester before his eyes were fully open. He moved with a terrifying, silent speed, crossing the cabin floor and peering through a narrow slit in the heavy wooden window shutters. "Get up, Clara," he ordered, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the room like a physical command. "Boots on. Stay below the window line." Clara scrambled out of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't ask questions. She pulled on her boots, grabbed the Colt from the bedside table, and crouched beside the stone hearth. "What is it?" she breathed. "Visitors," Jedediah replied grimly. 4 of them, coming up the eastern ridge. They aren't local deputies. They move too well. Pinkertons, or hired guns from the railroad camps. He tossed her a heavy woolen coat. "Caldwell must have realized you actually went through with the marriage. He knows the land grant is legally secure, as long as we both breathe. So, he sent men to ensure we don't." Jedediah checked the action on his rifle. "I am going out the back, through the smokehouse, and circle around the timberline. I will catch them in a crossfire. You stay here. If anyone breaches that door, you empty that cylinder into their chest. Do you understand?" Clara looked at the heavy oak door, then at the gun in her trembling hands. The theoretical practice was over. Death was walking up their front path. She looked up at Jedediah, finding strength in his unwavering gaze. "I understand." Jedediah reached out, his thumb gently grazing her jawline, a fleeting, fiercely protective gesture. "I will not let them touch you, Clara." He slipped out the back door, melting into the snowy landscape like a phantom. Clara was left alone in the suffocating silence of the cabin. Minutes stretched into eternity. She could hear the wind howling around the eaves, masking the sound of approaching footsteps. She gripped the Colt so tightly her knuckles ached, keeping her eyes locked on the heavy iron latch of the front door. Suddenly, a gunshot shattered the morning stillness. It was a heavy, booming crack Jedediah's Winchester. Chaos erupted outside. Men began shouting, their voices laced with panic. A rapid volley of answering fire peppered the thick cedar logs of the cabin, raining splinters onto the floorboards. Clara pressed herself flat against the stone hearth, covering her ears. "He's in the trees," a rough voice hollered from the front yard. "Flank him, Pike! Flank him!" Clara heard heavy boots crunching rapidly through the snow, moving along the side of the cabin, heading toward the back where Jedediah had exited. If they flanked him, he would be caught in the open. Without thinking, driven by a desperate, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed, Clara crawled to the side window. She slowly pushed the heavy wooden shutter open just an inch. A man in a heavy duster, clutching a repeating rifle, was creeping along the cabin wall, his back to the window, his eyes scanning the tree line for Jedediah. Clara raised the Colt. Her hands were shaking violently. She remembered Jedediah's voice in her ear. "Stance wide. Support your hand. Do not anticipate." She rested the heavy barrel on the windowsill, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The gun roared. The man outside let out a startled, wet scream, his rifle clattering to the ground as he clutched his thigh and collapsed into the snow. Instantly, the woods fell dead silent. The remaining hired guns realized they were boxed in the mountain man in the trees, and a shooter inside the fortress. "Drop your weapons!" Jedediah's voice echoed from the timber, amplified by the valley walls, making him sound like a god of wrath. "The next man who raises a rifle loses his head." Clara watched through the crack in the shutter as two men slowly emerged from the brush, their hands raised high, dropping their weapons into the snow. Jedediah stepped out from the shadows of the pines, his Winchester leveled flawlessly at their chests. He moved toward them, kicking their discarded weapons away. Clara unbolted the door and stepped out onto the porch, the smoking Colt still in her hand. The freezing wind whipped her hair around her face. Jedediah glanced at her, taking in the scene the man bleeding in the snow beneath her window. "I told you to stay inside," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only a profound, dark awe. "He was flanking you," Clara replied, her voice remarkably steady. Jedediah turned his attention to the two uninjured men. They were hard-bitten thugs, but they looked absolutely terrified of the giant man standing before them. "Who sent you?" Jedediah demanded, pressing the barrel of his rifle under the chin of the taller one. "Caldwell," the man stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "Mayor Caldwell. He paid us $500 to make sure neither of you made it to the county clerk. He said the railroad would double it if the cabin was burned to the ground. And if you failed?" The man swallowed hard. He said he had insurance. Down in town. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her that had nothing to do with the snow. "What? Insurance?" she demanded, stepping off the porch. The man looked at her, then back to Jedediah. "He sent Deputy Clinton to arrest the preacher, Reverend Finch, and his wife. He locked them in the town jail. Caldwell said if you didn't surrender the valley deed to him by Friday noon, he's going to hang the Reverend for conspiring to forge a fraudulent marriage certificate and aiding a known fugitive." Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Josiah and Martha Finch. They were innocent. They had only helped her because Jedediah had forced their hand, and now Caldwell was going to murder them to cover his legal tracks. Jedediah slowly lowered his rifle. The slate gray of his eyes darkened until they looked like black ice. He didn't execute the men. He ordered them to bind their wounded companion and start walking back down the mountain. "Tell Mayor Caldwell," Jedediah told them, his voice deadly quiet, "that his insurance policy has been noted. Tell him Jedediah Rollins is coming down the mountain to deliver the deed personally." As the terrified men dragged their bleeding comrade down the trail, Clara turned to her husband. "They will kill Josiah and Martha. Caldwell owns the judge. He can manufacture a hanging order in an hour. He won't hang them before Friday noon. He needs the leverage, Jedediah said, turning back toward the cabin. Pack the saddlebags, Clara.
This
All
story
the
was
ammunition
posted
we
on the
have.
channel The Rusty
We are
Saddle.
going back?
Please do not repost
Jedediah
it in any
stopped and looked
form.
back at her. The mountain man had vanished. The U.S. Marshall stood in his place, radiating a terrifying, focused purpose. You asked me to kill a man for you, Clara. I am going to do better than that. We are going to take their town, burn their corruption to the ground, and take back what belongs to you. The descent from Whispering Pines was a freezing, grueling march through the dark. They rode not as a newlywed couple, but as a heavily armed cavalry of two. Jedediah wore his canvas duster over his heavy winter coat, his federal badge now pinned openly, catching the pale moonlight that filtered through the timber. Clara rode beside him, the Colt revolver holstered at her hip, a repeating rifle resting across her saddle horn. Her fear had been burned away by the icy wind, replaced by a cold, crystalline anger. They reached the outskirts of Oakhaven just past midnight on Thursday. The town was eerily quiet, save for the raucous piano music spilling from the rusty spur and the occasional drunken shout. The muddy streets were frozen solid, treacherous, and rutted. Jedediah halted Thunder behind the abandoned livery stable on the edge of town. He dismounted and helped Clara down, his hands lingering on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The jailhouse sits on the corner of Elm and Main, Jedediah whispered, drawing a rough map in the frozen dirt with the toe of his boot. It is a brick building, iron-barred windows. Caldwell will have men stationed outside and inside. If we just ride up, it becomes a siege, and the Finches will catch a stray bullet. We need a diversion, Clara stated, her mind racing. She knew the town layout better than he did. The Pacific Northwestern Railroad has a supply depot on the east end of town. It is packed with blasting powder, kerosene, and dry timber for the new trestle bridge. If it catches fire, every deputy in town will have to respond to keep the whole block from going up. Jedediah looked at her, a slow, dangerous smile touching the corner of his mouth. You want to burn the railroad's depot, Mrs. Rollins? I want to save my friends, Clara replied, her voice steady. And I want to watch Mayor Caldwell lose his investment. Take the gray mare, Jedediah instructed, handing her a tin of sulfur matches from his saddlebag. Ride the back alleys. Do not engage anyone. Light the fire, wait for the bell to ring, and then ride directly to the rear of the jailhouse. I will meet you there. If I am not there within 10 minutes of the bell, he paused, the weight of the unspoken possibility hanging between them. You ride back up the mountain and don't look back. Clara grabbed his heavy coat, pulling him down slightly so she could look directly into his eyes. You promised me a dead sheriff and a dead mayor, Jedediah Rollins. You do not get to die before your debts are paid. Jedediah's gaze softened for the briefest moment. Yes, ma'am. Clara slipped away into the shadows, leading the mare through the narrow alleys she had once scrubbed and swept. The railroad depot was guarded by a single, shivering watchman who was more interested in his flask of cheap whiskey than his surroundings. Clara tied her horse to a post a block away, crept to the rear of the loading dock, and found exactly what she was looking for: a stack of burlap sacks soaked in leaking kerosene. She struck the match. The sulfur flared bright blue, then yellow. She dropped it onto the burlap. The fire caught instantly, a hungry, whooshing sound that rapidly climbed the wooden slats of the depot wall. Clara ran. She was halfway down the alley when the first barrel of blasting powder ignited. The explosion rattled the windows of Oakhaven. A massive plume of orange flame shot into the night sky, illuminating the town in an artificial dawn. Immediately, the church bell began to toll wildly. Men poured out of the saloon and the boarding houses, shouting in panic. Fire. The depot was burning. At the jailhouse, Jedediah waited in the shadows of the alley. As Clara predicted, the explosion threw the guards into chaos. 3 deputies burst out of the front door, rifles in hand, staring at the inferno, threatening the eastern block. "Get over there," Sheriff Wyatt Eakin roared, emerging from the jailhouse with his coat half on. "If that fire hits the main stockpile, it'll level the bank." The deputies ran toward the blaze, leaving Eakin and one other man at the door. Jedediah didn't wait. He stepped out of the alley, the silver star gleaming on his chest, a Winchester leveled at his hip. "Sheriff Eakin," Jedediah's voice boomed over the distant roar of the fire. Eakin spun around, his hand dropping to his sidearm, but he froze when he saw the badge and the massive barrel of the rifle pointed squarely at his chest. "Rollins," Eakin spat, his face pale in the firelight. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction, Marshal." "My jurisdiction is wherever men like you breathe," Jedediah replied, taking a slow, measured step forward. "Unlock the cells. Let the Reverend and his wife go." The remaining deputy panicked. He raised his shotgun, but Jedediah fired from the hip before the man could pull the trigger. The heavy round shattered the deputy's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the frozen mud. Eakin drew his revolver, but Jedediah was faster. He didn't shoot to kill, not yet. He fired a round that took off the heel of Eakin's boot, sending the sheriff crashing to the boardwalk. Jedediah crossed the distance in 2 massive strides, kicking Eakin's gun into the street and hauling the man up by his collar. Inside the jail, Reverend Finch and Martha were huddled in the corner of a cell, terrified by the gunfire. "Keys! Now!" Jedediah growled, pressing the barrel of his rifle beneath Eakin's jaw. Trembling, Eakin produced the iron ring. Jedediah unlocked the cell, swinging the door wide. "Go," he told the older couple. "Clara is waiting with horses in the back alley. Ride to the Methodist church and stay in the cellar." Martha Finch looked at the towering man, tears streaming down her face. "God bless you, Mr. Rollins." "He hasn't yet, ma'am," Jedediah replied grimly. As the Finches fled, Jedediah turned his attention back to Eakin. He dragged the sheriff out into the street. The fire was raging in the distance, casting long, dancing shadows across the muddy thoroughfare. "Now," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "where is the mayor?" Mayor Harrison Caldwell was not at the fire. He was standing on the second-story balcony of the Oak Haven Bank, watching his railroad investments burn to the ground. He was a wealthy man, dressed in a tailored wool suit and a silk cravat. But at this moment, his face was contorted in sheer, unadulterated rage. He turned away from the balcony, marching back into his opulent office, pouring himself a heavy glass of bourbon. "Caldwell." The mayor dropped his glass. It shattered on the Persian rug. Standing in the doorway of his office was Clara Rollins, her Colt leveled directly at his chest. Behind her, blocking the hallway, stood Jedediah, his hand firmly gripping the collar of a bleeding, terrified Sheriff Eakin. "Mrs. Higgins," Caldwell breathed, trying to recover his composure. He sneered. "Or should I say, Mrs. Rollins? You have made a terrible mistake coming here." "The mistake was yours, Harrison," Clara said, stepping fully into the room. She didn't blink. "You murdered my husband for a ledger book, and you tried to burn my new home to the ground for a land deed. You have no proof of anything," Caldwell scoffed, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany desk. Clara knew he kept a Derringer in the top drawer. Jedediah shoved Eakin forward. The sheriff stumbled and fell to his knees in the center of the room. "Eakin just sang a very different tune," Jedediah said smoothly. "He confessed to hiring the men who shot Peter Higgins, and he confessed that you paid him out of the town's municipal funds to do it. It seems the U.S. Marshals and Helena are going to be very interested in this town's bookkeeping." Caldwell paled. He looked at Eakin with absolute disgust. "You spineless fool. They were going to kill me, Harrison," Eakin cried. "I still am," Jedediah corrected coldly. Caldwell realized his political shield was shattered. Desperation took over. He lunged for the desk drawer, yanking it open and grasping the pearl-handled Derringer inside. He didn't even get to raise it. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, deafening in the enclosed space of the office. Jedediah's Winchester roared, a heavy slug tearing through Caldwell's right shoulder, spinning him violently against the bookshelves. But it was Clara's shot that ended it. Her Colt smoked in her hand. The bullet caught Caldwell squarely in the chest. He gasped, a look of profound shock crossing his aristocratic features before he collapsed behind his desk, dead before he hit the floor. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the distant crackle of the burning depot and the terrified whimpering of Sheriff Eakin. Clara slowly lowered her revolver. She looked at the blood pooling on the Persian rug, expecting to feel horror or regret. Instead, she felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from her chest. Peter was avenged. The men who had terrorized Oakhaven were broken. Jedediah stepped forward.
This story was posted on the
resting a heavy
channel The
hand on
Rusty
her
Saddle.
shoulder.
Please do
The
not
warmth of his
repost it
touch
in any
grounded
form.
her in the present. He looked down at Eakin. "I made my wife a promise," Jedediah said to the cowering sheriff. "I told her I would kill the men responsible for her suffering." Eakin squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the bullet. "But," Jedediah continued, holstering his sidearm and pulling a heavy pair of iron shackles from his belt, "I am also a federal marshal, and hanging you in a courtroom in Helena will do far more damage to the men who backed you than leaving you dead on this floor." Jedediah hauled Eakin to his feet, clamping the irons brutally tight around his wrists. "You are going to ride with us to the territorial capital, and you are going to tell the governor everything." As they led Eakin out of the bank and into the cold night air, the townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn away from the fire by the gunfire. They watched in stunned silence as the mountain man and the scrub woman dragged the most powerful man in town through the mud in chains. Deputy Clinton emerged from the crowd, his hand hovering over his gun. "Let him go, Rollins." Jedediah didn't break his stride. He looked directly at Clinton, his slate-gray eyes promising absolute destruction. "Mayor Caldwell is dead. Eakin is under federal arrest. If any man in this town wishes to object, draw your weapon now." Nobody moved. Clinton slowly backed away, raising his hands. Jedediah turned to Clara, offering her the reins to her mare. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Rollins?" Clara looked at the town that had tried to break her, then up to the towering, jagged peaks of the Bitterroots that were now illuminated by the rising sun. She touched the bone ring on her left hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Take me to the mountain." Historical records in the Montana Territorial Archives state that in the spring of 1884, a massive federal investigation dismantled a corrupt syndicate operating out of Oakhaven. Sheriff Wyatt Eakin was hanged in Helena for embezzlement and the murder of Peter Higgins. The Pacific Northwestern Railroad quietly abandoned its plans to route through the Bitterroots, leaving the high valleys untouched. As for Jedediah and Clara Rollins, they faded into the mythos of the frontier. They never returned to Oakhaven. Local legend claims that the mountain man and his wife built a sprawling, prosperous ranch in a hidden valley called Whispering Pines, raising horses, children, and a legacy of unyielding frontier justice. They say that if you ride high enough into the snow-capped peaks, you can still find the descendants of a federal lawman and a widow who struck a bargain in the shadows, a bargain sealed by blood, snow, and a single, chilling question that changed the West forever.